Welcome to our website here at awakeningnews.ca and our new YouTube channel. I'm the consulting editor of Awakening News, Mark Anderson. Here on the 29th day of July 2018, I'm with Awakening News Associate Editor John Devine. How are you doing today, John?
Morning, Mark. How are you doing?
Good to be back with you for our new set of videos here. And we're talking today about intellectual property. It's a big issue. It's been going on around the world. One of the reasons that President Trump, like him or not, imposed tariffs on China, among the reasons, is that some of the Chinese products are the result of stealing intellectual property from the U.S., counterfeiting names and brands. The actual technology itself is pirated. It's incorporated into a product, and some of the U.S. tariffs are against those products. Not to mention the decades of trade deficits the U.S. has ran with China, with the U.S. on the losing end, having sacrificed and forfeited billions over the years. And so it's a big issue, and yet as you bring it in closer, we can, on this show today, we can bring the intellectual property rights issue closer to home and make it much more relevant to show you the unequal application of the law and the kind of hidden little nooks and crannies on this big issue as we try to blow the whistle on it. John, what have you learned? I know your experiences as a former business owner with Fisherman's Cove here in Ontario brought you face to face with intellectual property issues over the years. What did you encounter?
Well, in a chronological order, our first concerns happened at our little business at Fisherman's Cove, where we previously stated the success we had in advancing water preservation technology, which is where we built our first closed system. But that property was expropriated, and disturbance and damages were not addressed, that being to demolish and build the buildings on the land not expropriated. But in our trip to find out why we didn't have that protection, we talked to Member of Provincial Parliament Randy Hillier, a landowner expert and whatnot, and he was quite concerned about the recent ruling at Abitibi, which stated that American landowners doing business in Canada, in that case it was Newfoundland, that they will be awarded disturbance and damages. But the way the law in NAFTA is agreed to, that we, the Canadian landowner, are not afforded the same considerations. So thus we pursued the issue about the unequal application of law when it comes to expropriation, when it comes to addressing intellectual property. So, and the tragedy of the matter is here that what we've been trying to do is tell everybody about the success we had in the closed system. Again, we discussed that before, but it's worthwhile mentioning again. You're talking about the savings of probably 1 billion gallons a day of groundwater if all fish hatcheries in North America use this same system.
A closed system rather than a flow-through open system, which uses something like 2,000 gallons a minute. So intellectual property, or the theft thereof, has real-world consequences.
Absolutely.
On top of the fact that you have this imbalance, we have Americans and Canadians reading the Awakening News. It's a kind of a two-country publication in a way, and you have American companies or individuals having more property rights within Canada on Canadian soil under NAFTA than Canadian citizens do. Talk about the scales being off.
And I tried to confirm that with MPP Hillier after I wrote to him and talked to him. And I wrote back again, asking for a confirmation. He didn't reply, so I have to believe what he said is correct, that we do not have the same protections as the American landowners do operating in Canada.
So that's one way that intellectual property and property rights in general, as an extension of intellectual property, land property rights and whatnot, natural resources, come into play in a real world way. Technologies that could preserve billions of gallons of groundwater are taken offline, and wasteful systems are kept online. So ladies and gentlemen, this is the real world consequences. It's not just Trump and tariffs, as important as that may be in the geopolitical sense. But what else have you learned along the way over the last, Fisherman's Cove was in the early 1990s in Ontario, not too far from Aurelia. What else have you learned along the way about pirating, scams, intellectual property rights issues, myriad things?
Just before I go there, the Fisherman's Cove store itself was the purchaser of American boats from Smoker Craft, and that in its own right has to interest to manufacturers in the United States who are selling to us under NAFTA. And that whole, their customer, Fisherman's Cove, was destroyed, so they've lost revenue from that. And I've yet to get a hold of Smoker Craft, but I'm sure they have to be interested in that. Now, that's where we moved from there. After being displaced from business and displaced from a home, I caught on as a dealer at Casino Rama. And that's where I started to do our own newspaper, because the media outlets wouldn't help us inform the public about this problem of intellectual property.
So when you tried to report on what happened at Fisherman's Cove with standard mainstream media, including the tax-funded CBC, you really got nowhere.
Exactly. So that motivated my son Mark and myself to start up our own newsletter.
A predecessor called Worlds Apart.
That's correct, yes, yeah. And so we started, and at the same time, under the roof of the casino where I was working, we gave numerous documents to Penn National, the managers of the casino, middle management of Penn National, as well as the CEO, in regards to what happened to the intellectual property of Fisherman's Cove and so on like that. And it was summarized by the word lawlessness, because there's discriminatory application of the law. So we go down that road, we start publishing Worlds Apart, and in the middle of that second, third publication, Penn National approached us and asked us if we would want to introduce our story into their weekly newsletter inside the casino. We said, well, maybe you better look at all of what we got here so we're all on the same page and nobody's concerned about liabilities. Instead of that, we continued on. We published our fourth Worlds Apart edition, addressing our concerns about discriminatory practice of law. And
did they publish some stuff in their newsletter about what happened at Fisherman's Cove, even a short article?
No.
They only took a look at it and showed some initial interest.
Yeah, they had 2 years of looking at all the documents and whatnot, and finally they decided that, why they decided to cancel it, I don't know,
but their common interest was, they did feel you were treated unfairly, and they had at least a general curiosity about what happened to Fisherman's Cove in intellectual property rights and so on. But nothing really happened with them publishing it, that despite all the material you gave them. But then what happened?
And so we brought out edition 4 and took it into the casino for distribution. And shortly after it gets into the employees' lounge, middle management comes storming into the lounge and grab edition 4 to the hands of all our readers. Now bear in mind, edition 4 and Worlds Apart is registered as intellectual property of Mark and John Devine. And so to me, my observation is that is a violation of NAFTA, stealing of intellectual property out of the hands of people who are reading. So that infraction right there caused me serious concern as to why they would do that, because in edition 4 we're trying to tell everybody about the pirating of intellectual property of U.S. movie producers. And so all of a sudden they went from interest to what would you say, the enemy, if you want to call it that. Anybody?
Interest when it was Fisherman's Cove and it was seemingly innocuous to them, but no interest and in fact hostility when it got a little closer to home.
Yes.
And it was closer to home, the pirating of U.S. movies. Why was it closer to home for Penn National, the management of the casino?
Well, Penn National was involved in 2 sides of the pirating. They were involved in one of their employees selling the pirated movies, and it was also involved in employees as well as an in-house OPP buying the stolen intellectual property.
And Penn National is now the former manager of Casino Rama.
Yeah, they just left recently. They finally get out of town.
So part of their legacy was within the walls of Casino Rama, U.S. movies, intellectual property that Hollywood professes all this concern about, the pirating of their movies, were moving through there with some employees selling and some buying.
Yeah.
So back when they stole your intellectual property, the newsletter trying to report this, it was a double whammy. Your property being stolen and Hollywood's.
Yeah, and we were basically the whistleblowers, so what we did was blew the whistle to the Securities and Exchange Commission in New York, and we also...
It's a U.S. company after all.
Yeah, and we
Penn
also...
National's a U.S. company.
Exactly.
In a Canadian casino.
And then we wrote to the U.S. Movie Producers Association. I believe the gentleman in charge at the time was Mr. Glickman.
Okay.
And we told him about the people he's representing, their intellectual property being stolen, and we never got a reply back. So every time we blew the whistle, the end result was silence.
The town crier has no people in town to hear him crying.
Yeah, exactly. And to culminate the story under the roof of Casino Rama, we had a written letter given to us, threatening us. They already suspended us for a week and threatening us, if you write anything more about this stealing of intellectual property and other issues of law that we're blowing the whistle on, we'll fire you. And that's when I shut it down. But then I went and wrote to the commissioner of the OPP. At that time it was Mr. Lewis.
Chris Lewis, who has since become a consultant for CTV Media.
That's correct.
He made the leap, an unusual leap, at least in my circles, in my some 30 years in journalism, to go from police work to journalistic work. A rather unusual move, at least in Canadian circles.
It is. It seems to be more common in the States. You'll see a lot of commentators, CNN and whatnot, who were former heads of the FBI, CIA, and so on like that.
Yeah, you don't see it as much here, is what I'm getting at.
No, exactly right. And I wonder whether up here, like Mr. Lewis, when he moves into the media part, whether he's still allowed to retain his security clearances, something which down in the States they're talking about taking away from some of these commentators.
Yeah, they're afraid that they'll divulge stuff they knew from their former job. Yeah.
So not getting into that argument about whether they're right or not, but
correct.
The thing is, Mr. Lewis, I think if he didn't lose his security clearance, we're starting to wonder whether he's obliged now to go back in time. I keep talking about the time machine, and address the issue that he wanted to address when he asked his officers to address our whistleblowing efforts.
He asked his officers to address them, but just to touch on that briefly, that little trail of inquiry hit a dead end.
Well, it did when the third officer on the chain came to our house with the threats of reprisal.
So the whistleblower becomes the problem rather than the hero.
Yeah,
in their eyes.
In their eyes, yeah. Like in my eyes, we become the victim.
And to summarize today's broadcast, we see often in Canadian culture, some in America, but especially here, actually both countries now, if something looks out of whack, report it. If you see something, say something. Department of Homeland Security, United States, similar agencies here in Canada, you saw something, you said something, and you're continuing your inquiries. This isn't all past tense stuff, ladies and gentlemen. These things ripple on for years. And yet when you've said something based on what you've seen, you've ran into a brick wall. So, intellectual property rights being one important issue for whistleblowing, among other things, are these whistleblowing laws worth the paper they're printed on?
It doesn't appear to be. I mean, my belief was, as a whistleblower, if somebody obstructs you, the whistleblower, for trying to tell the authorities something that might be illegal or might want to be interesting to the public so we can make it illegal, if you're obstructed from doing that, in one way or another, it's my belief you've obstructed the judicial process.
Yeah, that they're enabling the crime to go on, even if it's a passive obstruction, even if it's passing the piece of paper onto the wrong bin, rather than the still active bin, it's put in the retired bin. The slightest move is enabling the wrongdoings to go on.
Well, one little example of that, I was watching television one night, and the premier at the time, McGinty, was calling upon everybody to blow the whistle on issues in regards to civil disobedience or whatever. But what they're saying is, and they depicted a picture of a young man on the street walking up to an old lady, and she opens her purse and hands out money to him. And if you're suspicious about why that money was handed over, you're supposed to call the police. Well, the next day I go to work at Casino Rama, and I witness the assault on a senior citizen, and so I stop the game I'm dealing immediately, and I call the floor supervisor to call the police. He said, "I can't do that, I got to call the pit boss." So he calls the pit boss, and the pit boss wouldn't call the police. So all of what I witnessed and everything standing in front of me was never investigated, and everything left. And from there on out, the assault happened, I blew the whistle, and nobody responded.
And the lady handing the money out could be interpreted different ways. It may or may not be a bad thing. What you saw was unambiguous. It was inarguably a bad thing.
Exactly. So that's worthy of blowing the whistle. So that one more time of many, many times we blew the whistle. And the end result of all that festering corruption that we kept witnessing, whatnot, including the Ministry of Labor, which we discussed previously, I end up getting cut from the payroll. So I caution anybody that's in the business of wanting to blow the whistle in Canada, be careful. If it's not government, they might listen to you, but if it's government, be careful.
Yeah, and I think with that, ladies and gentlemen, there's some food for thought, and we'll talk more about this in articles that have already been posted and videos that we've been posting, and future videos and articles as intellectual property matters and other matters, both large and small, come into play. And again, there's some food for thought, and we'll see you here next time. I'm Mark Anderson for awakeningnews.ca. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Mark. Good conversation.